QSO Today, episode 231, John Raifsnider W8JER. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator. Visit ICOM at www.icomamerica.com/amateur to find your rig for the new year. And by QRP Labs, makers of the QCX single-band transceiver kit and a host of other QRP radio kits and parts for the ham radio builder. Click on the link to QRP Labs in this week's show notes page. Please support the QSO Today podcast by supporting these fine sponsors. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, 4Z1UG, your host. This is the first QSO Today episode of 2019. I want to thank all of you who were and are listener sponsors, have made donations and funded transcripts. All of this support, in addition to our commercial sponsors over the last year, including ICOM America and QRP Labs, really helped to keep these interviews coming to you every week. Frankly, I have to say that I think that outside of my 36-year marriage to my ex-YL Karen, that the QSO Today podcast has been the largest and steady project of my life, consistently produced over the last 4.5 years. Perhaps as much work as getting a PhD in amateur radio. I often say this, and it's true, that I've learned more about amateur radio and amateur radio operators in the last 4.5 years than in the previous 40 years before I started the podcast. My QSO today is with John Raifsnider W8JER. John has a long amateur radio history, likes to rag chew on single sideband with his DX contacts from his ham shack that he shares with his ex-YL Micky KE8ASK. John has upped his game recently by installing a 70-foot tower and beam at his QTH, allowing he and Micky to discover new ham radio territory. W8JER shares his love of hamfests, meeting new people, including former President Jimmy Carter, in this QSO today. W8JER, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, John?
Yes, Eric, I'm here.
John, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It was Greg Lane, N4KGL, my guest in episode 30 of the QSO Today podcast, who suggested that I contact you and your wife, Micky, KE8ASK. He also pointed out to me that you have over 4 million views on your QRZ page. Any idea why you have over 4 million views?
I do, Eric. I keep that top secret. The main reason for that is I looked up to see who had the most views that I could find, and it was W1AW, and I strive to equal or surpass them. Just can't do it. But there is a trick to it. I'll leave it go at that.
It's something that you're doing. It's something that you're actually causing people to look you up.
Actually, I found a way to kind of skew the numbers, and there's a bit of an addition there.
Okay. So that's interesting to know. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, I started out with an interest in electronics when I was very young. I think I was about 8 years old. We had an old airline console, wooden console radio with a big tuning eye, and it said something about shortwave. And my father asked me what I wanted for my birthday, and I said, I'd just like to have that old radio. And he said, well, it doesn't work. So we went to the store and tested all the tubes and bought tubes, and that was my birthday present, to have that shortwave radio. And that got me interested, and I strung wires and antennas and, hooked onto water pipes and all to try to achieve the best signals on the shortwave listening. From there, I ended up in high school where I had a science teacher that was a ham operator. His call was K9EJZ, and he made it a habit of staying after school and running ham radio courses. And if we made it past our novice tests and 1 year of being a novice and wanted to advance, he took us all to Chicago to the Federal Building to upgrade to either technician general or whatever we could do. That was in 1964. In 1965, I passed the code and passed the test for the technician class license, and then in 1976, I upgraded to the advanced class with the code test at the federal building, and have never ever wavered in really enjoying this hobby. I do have one interesting aspect in the beginning. My first renewal for amateur radio license was in 1970. Having gotten my license past novice in 1965, 1970 became the anniversary date to upgrade, and back then we had to have activity, log activity and operating activity, and certify them. Well, it just so happened I'd been drafted into the U.S. Army, and I was in the middle of Vietnam during 1970, and a friend of mine, one of my mentors, sent my mother a letter and said, Johnny's got to renew his license or he's not going to be a ham anymore. So he worked out the forms and things to send to my mother to send to me to new, and to do that in Vietnam, I had to carry a letter to my commanding officer, and 40 miles away in Long Binh, to have him certify that I was not capable of operating ham radio due to service in a foreign country, and that's the end of that story. But anyway, so I renewed and updated my first amateur license while serving in Vietnam.
What was your first call sign?
My first call sign was a novice call of WN8OKA. And then that, of course, became WA8OKA.
And the hometown was?
My hometown was White Pigeon, Michigan, a little town of about 1,300 people.
Were there other hams in town? Were there other hams who were your contemporaries?
Oh, yes. There were several. This instructor, actually, he was from Indiana, the state south of us, and he was teaching in White Pigeon. So, but there were many hams in White Pigeon at the time, and a lot of activity on 2-meter AM with Heathkit tours.
And the high school kids who had ham licenses, were they on 2 meters, or was this like the whole community that was on 2 meters with the tours?
Well, most of them had a tour, and most of them that did not progress beyond the novice license, all they ever had were tours. I personally had a tour, but I was building a CW rig that was in the ARRL handbook, and my father worked in a tin shop at the time where he had access to heavy gauge solid copper plate, and he made me a beautiful copper chassis and a faceplate to build my one tube, I think it was a 6DQ5 oscillator, and what was typical of the day in the handbook. That was my CW rig, and I had a Heathkit HR10 receiver. Oh,
I remember the HR10. What did you think of that receiver? That was a Heathkit. Did you build it, or did you find it used?
I did not build it. One of my mentors gave it to me. I can't remember what the situation was, but he was a guy that had projects that if you help me with this, I'll do something. So he gave me that HR10. They were a great receiver, I think they came on the market for $70 or something, and they were really good for, ham band only, but for entry-level novices of the day, they were wonderful. I really enjoyed it.
So later on, you upgraded to technician class and then to advanced class. How did your rigs progress after that? Yeah, it sounds to me like you like being a CW operator, or at least that's where you started.
Well, I started that as a novice because I had to, get my code speed up to move on to the next license class. And the advanced class license, I believe at the time, was 13 words a minute. At taken in front of the white shirts at the federal building. It was pretty scary, for a young man to go there, and so no, CW has never been my favorite. I like it, but I seldom operate. I tell everybody I grew up as a child of a family of 4 children, and my father worked hard to keep us in clothes and food, and he really didn't have a lot of money to buy a new ham operator equipment. So I stuck with a tour in that HR-10 and the homebrew rig for quite a while. And as I got, into working, my first license came at age 14, so I had no real means of income other than mowing a lawn on occasion. But as the progression went, I moved up to some 2-meter gear, to the Amico TX62, 6 and 2 meter AM transmitter, where I built the Heathkit VHF converters for 6 and 2 meters and interfaced them onto my HR-10 and operated a lot of VHF. And then, of course, in 1969, I went in the service. I had, at that time, built a Heathkit SB110 single sideband transceiver and used that very regular. But upon entry into the service and getting orders for Vietnam, I thought, I better just get rid of this stuff. So I sold my SB110 thinking I'd never see it again. And, that was the truth. I survived Vietnam, and I never saw the rig again. The guy that had it wouldn't let it come back, and he passed, and it disappeared. So when I progressed to the advanced class, where did I start there? Drake TR4C. And that took me into, a modern factory-built radio that was really, really fun.
Now, it's my understanding, based on what you're saying, is that you were drafted right out of high school into Vietnam, so you didn't even have a chance to decide whether electronics or a radio would be your profession or field. Is that right?
That is correct. I was drafted at age 19, and I was actually working as a marine mechanic and at a marina here locally, doing some repair of outboard marine engines. And no, I was not even done with the thought process of furthering my education or what I would become in the future.
Where were you drafted to, and what did you do?
Well, I was drafted into the Army, and because I was a ham radio operator, I lined up somewhere between Einstein and Edison on what they would promise me I was capable of, and I ended up extending my enlistment for a year to go to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, to U.S. Army Signal School. And I spent 7 months there learning to be a fixed station facility controller of a microwave site with ingoing, outgoing telephone, telegraph, facsimile machines of the day.
You had the ability to sign on a little bit longer in order to go to the U.S. Army Signal School in order to avoid actually being infantry, for example.
Absolutely. Well, that was the sales pitch I was given. That you're going to Vietnam. You're going to be infantry, and you have all the qualifications to be this high-tech radio operator, and you will not go to Vietnam. But if you do, a lot of promises if you do. Anyway, I had the impression that I would not, even at that age, I would not waste 2 years of my life going somewhere carrying a gun for no good purpose in my mind, and I would try to make something of myself. So I thought this signal school was an interesting aspect.
Now, how long did you stay in the Army? I got the impression, maybe from looking at your QRZ site, that you'd actually made a career of the military. Is that possible?
No. I did my 3-year enlistment and got out.
And what happened after that?
Well, after that, I came back to my home and one morning my mother shook the bed and said, you've been there long enough. Your brother-in-law called and said there's a job available at the factory in town. So I went and applied for the job and got it. I spent a year in the production of curtain rods and drapery hardware, and an opportunity came up for an apprenticeship as a tool and die maker. And I didn't even know what a tool and die maker was, but my dad told me, if there's ever an apprenticeship available, take it. So I did, and that was my career for 35 more years, was being a tool and die maker.
Well, I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes page. But, John, for those of us that are younger who might be listening, what is a tool and die maker? What are you making exactly?
A tool and die maker makes manufacturing equipment like a die, a stamping die that would take a piece of flat steel stock and pierce it and fold it and do all things to make it come out as a bracket or, a usable metal part. And the other aspect was building injection molds to mold plastic parts and to actually build machines that did assembly or packaging, and we also built roll tooling that took flat stock and rolled it up into various shapes to make rods or aluminum or tubes out of steel that became curtain rods, and pretty wide field of just machining, fine finishing, and making tools that made parts.
And now this message from ICOM America, makers of the finest amateur radio transceivers for every level of amateur radio operator. Calling all hams. ICOM knows that amateur radio is all about community and wants to give back to the amateur radio community that has been loyal to it for over 50 years. To this end, ICOM has launched 2 initiatives. The first, ICOM has launched a promotion exclusively to ham radio clubs. By registering your ham radio club, your club could win an ICOM radio, ICOM swag, a live presentation on Skype, or a live in-person presentation by an ICOM rep at your ham radio club meeting. Secondly, according to the ARRL website, there are over 195 conventions and ham fests scheduled in the United States in 2019. ICOM knows that ham fests play a big role in to bring hams together to learn from their peers and radio industry leaders. ICOM has launched a promotion exclusively for Hamfest. Register your Hamfest today, and your Hamfest could win an ICOM swag, a forum presentation, or an ICOM booth set up at your Hamfest. For more information and to register your club or Hamfest, click on the ICOM image in this week's show notes page. You can also search on Twitter and the Internet using hashtag ICOM Everywhere, one word, that's hashtag ICOM Everywhere, or go to icomamerica.com/amateur to register your club or Hamfest. My thanks to ICOM America for being such a wonderful sponsor of the QSO Today podcast. Please be sure to tell your dealer on your next ICOM purchase that you heard it here on QSO Today. And now back to our QSO Today. That profession has been replaced, I think, maybe by people that operate CNC machines?
Pretty much, yes. In fact, the evolution of the machining equipment took me from, hand producing parts to going into machines, as you said, such as a CNC machining center to a electro discharge machines that actually burn the metal away, from using a stick of graphite shaped into the desired shape and size of the openings that you wanted to make, or a thin wire, as in wire EDMing, that actually cut the part out by passing a wire with coolant through it and burning it away. A very, very precision machine, CNC controlled.
So as I remember, as I understand tool and die making, you're actually working with drill presses and lathes and mills and things like this, but you're working on real heavy-duty steel, right? If you're making stamps, plastic injection molds, as I recall, those are not soft metals; those are really hard metals.
They're all considered tool steel, which is hardened sometimes prior to, but normally after the machining process, they would get hardened to, for durability. But in the advent of the CNC machines in EDMing, wire electrodischarge machines, the part could be made hardened from the beginning, and we would just put start holes in a block and square it all up and send it out and have it hardened. And then when it came back, we would use the EDM machine to burn the part out, the holes for the punch or the cavity for the mold, and it was all ready to go. Once it was wired out, it was already hardened and ready for service.
Greg, when he sent me a message and suggested that I interview you, he said, be sure to ask him about the Night Kit AM broadcaster and the role that it played in your high school years. What's that all about?
Oh, that's a very interesting story, Eric. When I was a youngster, I was doing a what we called patrol boy, and we would take a certain street corner, and at the end of school and before school and at lunchtime, we would leave a little bit early to go post at the street corner, and we would guide other kids across the street and back during lunchtime. And so I had built, I was probably 12 or 13 by then, and I had built a Night Kit wireless broadcaster, an AM transmitter that you could hook a phono cartridge to and play your records over it, or you could put a crystal mic on it and talk on it. I lived out in the country between two curves on a major highway, and I strung a piece of wire, and we only had AM in the day, so I knew the popular station in the area, so I dialed my broadcaster in on that station, thinking I could, catch people going by, and it worked. So I broadcast when I'd see a car coming around the corner. I would say, "Hey, you in the blue Ford pickup truck, blink your lights or honk your horn," and that worked for a while. And then I went on to, "Hey, you in the Chrysler, stop," and they'd stop, along the road, and it progressed through all kinds of things like that. Well, during my stint at Patrol Boy, I had the main intersection in the little village there was my station, and during inclement weather, the police chief would park there with me, and he was a wonderful man. He was a retired Greyhound bus driver, and so he let me sit in the cop car when it snowed or when it rained or whatever. And one day he said, "Hey, you're into electronics, aren't you? And you kind of understand these things." He said, "We have a little issue. We'd like to you could help us out." And he said he was out to the Michigan State Police post there a couple days earlier, and the police were talking about some guy that came in there and reported that he was asked to stop and pull off the road, kind of out in the area of where you live, and we just wondered if you knew anything about who might be, able to or are broadcasting to over the car radio. And of course, I played real dumb and said no, but it was pretty obvious when all the broadcasting stopped out there. So that was the Night Kit broadcaster, and Greg has since bought one of those, and he always got a kick out of hearing that story.
Now, do you think the chief of police actually knew who was the culprit?
Oh, absolutely. He knew, and he just had a subtle way of telling me that, somebody's paying attention to you, and it's not a good thing to do.
In those days, they didn't come and just arrest you for breaking the law, right? There was a lesson to be learned there. There
was a lesson, and there was, and I'm sure if I'd have continued on without heeding their message, I probably would have got a slap on the wrist at least.
What's the current rig at your place?
Well, that's interesting. I just got a brand new one, and I said this radio, I've put it on Facebook and a few places showing my new radio, but I said this was Micky's radio. Her call's KE8ASK, and I said, this is my wife's radio. It's the new Kenwood TS890S. And but the current rig I've been running was the ICOM 7600 and a PW1 ICOM amplifier, and I've hooked that all up to a 70-foot tilt-over tower with a Mosley Pro 67B Yagi that covers 10 through 40 meters with all the work bands. But we're still in the learning stage on the new Kenwood radio, and was somewhat taken aback when we opened the box and there was no microphone in it. And having switched to pretty much all ICOM, that was a problem because we had no microphone to even, no hand mic or anything to even try it out.
As I understand, the ICOM mics are powered.
Yeah, they're all electret mics, where the Kenwoods and the Yaesus were dynamic mics mostly.
Now, I've seen great pictures of your installation of your 70-foot tilt-up tower on your QRZ page. It seems like this is a pretty challenging project, and I think there's a picture of you sitting next to it as it's like being cranked up or something. It's an interesting picture, but the biggest question I have is what's the greatest lesson that you've learned from installing that kind of a tower in your yard?
Well, it's been challenging. I bought the tower used. I bought it used with the antenna, the rotor, and the whole works, and the man even delivered it to me. It's a very expensive tower. It's a Heights tower from Pensacola, Florida. But it was only 4 years old, and he had to get rid of it. So we took a drive and looked at it and thought, yeah, I can do that. But the challenge became after it arrived, and we had to make a hole. And it has very specific instructions for what the base consists of. Because it tips over and goes out 70 feet and can lift a dead weight of over 300 pounds from the end, it has to have a pretty stable counter base under it. And that base became a hole 51 inches in diameter and 11 feet deep. Now, the gentleman that had the tower, I asked him how he got that hole, and he said, I just called the hydrovac company here, and they came over, and they use a high-pressure water wand and a vacuum truck, like they sweep up leaves or clean sewers locally, and they just suck up the mud till they've made a hole the size and depth of whatever you need. And so I said, well, what's that cost? And he said, $400. I thought, well, that's pretty reasonable. There's no mess. There's no mess around. The only thing disturbed is where they've started the hole on the top, and all the mud goes away. So I started calling around, and that became a problem. The first quote I got to make the hole was $4,510. And I was so disgusted in hearing that I merely said to the man calling, "What's the $10 for?" and abruptly hung up on him. As it progressed, the next bid came in at $2,700, and I had called everybody I could find on the internet. I finally found a young company about 120 miles away, said they'd send a truck down here. They would make that hole, and it would be between X and X amount of dollars. It ended up $670. I had a perfect hole. And then the next challenge was getting a rebar cage for it. So I ended up building the rebar cage in my garage with the help of the guy sitting on the ground is my friend Jeff, W8JER. He's been with me from the beginning on this project. And anyway, we built the rebar cage, which is quite extensive. It was 10.5 foot long and 46 inches in diameter, and so I had called a fabricator to do the job and gave him a print for it, and he wanted almost $900. Well, in all said, we built that rebar cage for $128 approximately, and ordering rebar from different places and bending it ourselves with pipes and muscle. So that was a challenge. Now, I kind of sense that maybe you're wondering about the zoning, the ordinances, the neighbors, and whatnot, but didn't ask the neighbors for approval. But we did call the city, and they said, we have a height limit on towers, and that's if it's an amateur radio tower, that is the only governing factor we have is a height limit for, glide path at the airport or whatever. So it was a pretty simple, no applications, no nothing to do other than maintain a height, and the rest of it was just trying to find contractors and people to do the work. And of course, it's you can see on the webpage, it's a big tower and it's pretty involved, but we found a way to put it all together after we had a base to bolt it to. So it was a challenge, but it's a very, very nice setup.
It looks like a beautiful setup, and the neighborhood that you live in also appears to be a nice neighborhood. But you've got a lot of trees and stuff, right? So it's not that the tower dominates the neighborhood.
No, it's quite visible now that all the leaves are gone. But it is amazing. When we moved to this home, we had lived just 10 blocks north on a major highway. This is a 2-block residential street that gets very little traffic. But we were up on the major highway before, and I put up a tower there with a hex beam. And you're familiar with how strange a hex beam may look. And we were at the end of we were on the highway, but we had another main road in town that came up and dead-ended right looking at our home. And it was amazing how no one ever looked up. They say that only hams look up for aluminum in the sky. And it pretty much is a true story that nobody, even our friends and relatives, after we put it up, we had to ask them what they thought of it because we were sure it was going to be just an attention getter that was, going to drive us nuts. But no, the neighborhood, my neighbors that have come over and commented on it think it is just cool. Because, the thing pulls itself up with that big lead screw. It just looks like an engineering miracle the way it works.
Well, maybe you'll talk a little bit about that. How do you tilt that thing back up? Do you actually have some cable and pulleys someplace that gives it a bigger angle, or are you doing it right from the base of the tower?
Eric, it's right at the base. There's a 4-foot base that's rigid in the concrete on clevises, and then the tower hinges up there at the 4-foot point, and it has a 1/2 horse Dayton gear motor with an 80-to-1 gear reduction, and that is turning a 1 1/4 inch Acme screw that just pulls between those 2 points. It hinges on the 2 legs out front, and it just pulls or allows it to open up that 3rd leg. It just pulls it all up right from the very end, and
amazing.
And it does it within 10 minutes up or 10 minutes down. It's pretty slow, but it's very sure. And like I say, it'll haul a big load up at the end.
What also seems to impress me about your story is that you're able to make a hole with water. Here where I live, they're putting vertical trash cans into the ground out in front for trash collection. And they have to come in with these rock breakers, and in order to dig a foot down into the ground, you actually have to break up the rocks under the ground. So we don't even have any topsoil here. So it's actually it's amazing that you can actually make a hole with water.
Well, we're in pretty sandy ground here. That after the topsoil, that machine will suck up a rock size of a baseball or bigger, and just without any problem throw it in the truck. But they made that hole 51 inches in diameter, 11 foot deep in 45 minutes, and it was just amazing. And it was almost so perfectly round, and when they were done, it was dry. I mean, they sucked up all the mud, And, of course, the deeper they went, the drier the soil got, so they needed less and less water. But the beautiful part of it is there's no undisturbed or no disturbed earth. When the concrete goes in, it's setting right next to, whatever had settled in there in the last 100 years. And, we use a service called Miss Dig. You call prior to making a hole anywhere. And Miss Dig comes out with, they send the electrical company, the sewer and water, and the gas utilities, and they all come out and put little flags in the ground to say where their lines are. And we were definitely way far away from any of those things. So the only thing we were figuring to contend with were rocks and roots. And we found 2 tree roots that came across through the hole that were about 1.5 inches in diameter. That 3,500 pounds of water, nipped them off like noodles. So really, it was a clean hole, no issues whatsoever.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, Greg, when he sent me the message about you, he also said that you and your wife, Micky, got married on the beach there in Florida a few years back. How is it you got to know Greg, and how is it that you got to end up getting married on the beach?
Well, we'd been staying at the dunes there for a couple of years at a condo on the beach, and we'd met a lot of people there. And when we first went down, I had been looking. I religiously look at QRZ.com always, and I saw a picture of the featured ham. And it was Greg, and he was standing with a rocket under his arm that was probably 8 foot tall and about 8 inches in diameter. And I had to go look at his webpage, and he was from Panama City Beach, Florida. That's exactly where we were going to be staying. So I emailed Greg, and I said, hey, we've got a condo down there that we want to, and I'd like to kind of get together with you and see some more of this rocket stuff. So Greg emailed and said, oh, yeah, and we go every 2 weeks. We go to Sampson, Alabama, and we got a 40-acre cotton field, and we shoot rockets, and 4 or 5 of us are hams. We put payloads on the rockets with maybe a little 20-meter beacons, and we have electronic altimeters. It just went on and on of the electronics involved. And so when we got down there, we met Greg and his wife, Linda, and we became really great friends. Well, we decided that we would marry down there on the beach, and we invited Greg and his wife, and of course people just from the condo came around and put on a wedding party for us, and can I make a cake, and can I do this and that? So we were just going to really keep it simple, with a couple of family members that had been there also, part-time or staying in Florida. So we became really good friends with Greg and Linda. And Greg's birthday is just 1 day away from mine, so we would always go out and celebrate with a nice dinner at the seafood restaurant, and so we keep in touch.
Now, did Greg get you into radar or rapid deployment amateur radio?
No. I don't have that much ambition to get out and run around on Saturday. I have a lot of equipment that could be put into service. But Greg is he's dyed-in-the-wool for that thing. He's got his dog, his puppy dog Susie, and a cart, and he's bought about every portable antenna there is. He's a master at it.
Yeah, he is indeed. And did you get into rocketry, or did you go out there a few times, or as a spectator?
We went every time. They were having a rocket launch. We went and just observed, and we did winter field day from there with a portable setup. I had a Yaesu FT817 and a mag loop antenna that I built, and we'd sat right there in the cotton field and work winter field day, and it was a great time.
Do you still work winter field day in Michigan?
I get involved with it, but I don't go out. I just work the stations that are, and pretty much stay in the house.
So you don't build an igloo in the yard or something like that in order?
No, not at all.
I mean, I hear about winter field day from people that are doing it, and it sounds atrocious on the one hand, but I'm used to warmer weather, and for me, I practically have to hibernate during the winter when it starts to get cold.
Yes, same here. And Greg, he just loves getting out and doing those portable installations. And then the interesting thing is they set up. They have to make 5 contacts, and then they can move on. And I'm not quite that ambitious, but if I lived in Florida versus Michigan, it might be a little easier to stay interested in that, where you got the weather that's always, other than rain, is
slightly warm.
Nice to get out and run. Yeah.
What's your favorite Hamfest?
My favorite, we love Orlando, but my favorite is Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville's the perfect venue as far as we're concerned. It's at the Von Braun Center downtown, and the Von Braun Center is a big convention center that has a walkway that connects it right to the host hotel, which is the Embassy Suites. The Embassy Suites, you get a cook-to-order breakfast every morning. You have the manager's cocktail party every evening for 2 hours, and you just walk across the walkway, and you're in the Von Braun Center. You're at the Hamfest. You need a break. You just go back to your room, take a nap, go back. And it's Dayton and Orlando and Huntsville are the 3 that we never miss. But Dayton being the biggest, Orlando always having wonderful weather, and but Huntsville, it doesn't matter what the weather does. You can stay inside for the whole time.
What's your favorite operating mode on your new rigs?
Well, my favorite is single sideband.
And do you chase DX, or do you just like to rag chew?
I like them both. I like to chase rag chewing DXers, but they're hard to find. And since I put up this new antenna, I've never operated 40 meters much. But this new tower I put up has a Mosley antenna that covers 10 through 40 meters. It's got 2 elements on 40 at 70 feet, and the guy I bought it from said you will really open your eyes when you see what 2 meters at 40 meters at 70 feet does for you. And I've worked just tons and tons of DX with this thing since I've put it up.
Now, do you notice a big difference between the Mosley and the hex beam?
Well,
I mean, obviously the height is going to make a big difference, but in terms of, did you enjoy operating on the hex beam?
I think the hex beam is a wonderful antenna, and I think for the price, and you can turn those things with a lightweight television rotator. I really enjoyed the hex beam, and I had full intentions of putting it up down here, but when I bought this tower, I bought the tower from a gentleman that had bought his lifelong dream of a lake house, and he said that tower needs an 11-foot hole, and he said at the lake we can't go more than 2 or 3 feet, and we're starting to fill the hole with water, so he had to get rid of it, and that was a complete package. The tower from the manufacturer, I tried to order it, and the lead time became objectionable. Couldn't do it. But the tower was like $13,000, and so anyway, when I canceled that deal, I found this exact tower, and a friend of mine told me about it, and I went on Google Earth and looked up the guy's address, and I could see this tower standing there. So we called him up, and Micky and I both drove up there and spent the day and looked it over. So it came with a Mosley Pro 67B that covered 10 through 40 meters, and with a heavy-duty rotor and the whole works delivered. So that's what swayed me away from the hex beam. But the hex beam, I think, is a wonderful antenna.
Right, and could have gone up on a push-up mast, I think, instead of a tower. But, if you've got the tower, why not? It sounds great.
Yeah.
What's your relationship to President Jimmy Carter and his wife, Rosalind?
Well, we have no real relationship to them. I've always had a respect for Jimmy. He's always been, there's not a lot of, if you look at presidential things, they're always kind of bashing Jimmy Carter, using him as a standard, but there's no finer human being on the face of the earth that I know of than he and his wife. And we go to, when we were staying in Florida, we would make it a point to go to the Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains, Georgia. And the Carters would always pose for a picture with us. And we've had the privilege of being with them 4 times. And other than the picture, we've gone to lunch with them as a group at the little buffet downtown, and just enjoyed the, just being able to be there and listen. Jimmy teaches Sunday school, so we would go there and listen to his preaching.
I think he's in his 90s now, I would think, right?
Yeah, I think he's 93 years old now.
Well, what was interesting about the pictures is that it appears that everyone's getting progressively older. So it looked like you had this, it was this like the same picture. You're standing in the same positions in each of the pictures. So it kind of looked like perhaps that you had a long-time relationship. And in fact, you did, actually. Yeah.
It's been, 4 or 5 years there that we met up with them. And I don't know. I've never met anybody really important in my life until we found out about that, and that we could get a picture with a past president.
Well, I think it's great.
And, yeah, it is. They're nice folks.
We're all 2 degrees of separation from just about everybody else on the planet.
Yeah.
It seems like.
Sure.
What do you think is the biggest challenge to amateur radio today?
Cell phones. The young group, I talk to people that are, heavy into the clubs and trying to promote ham radio. And I tried to steer them away from trying to drag them into starting out with the digital modes or the repeaters, because that's an easy place to get into and stop. But it's also a place when you say, well, if you do this and take these tests, you can talk to people across town or from your car. And it's so easy for them to say, I can do that on my cell phone. Well, you can hook into a internet node and you can talk to people all over the world. Well, I can do that on my cell phone if I know their phone number, and it's hard to convince young people the real value of ham radio, other than, the aspect of disasters and emergencies where they become really, really important means of communication. So I'm really not sure, Eric, but that's my take. If it's not cell phone related, it just doesn't seem to be real important, especially if you have to, earn it.
Well, I guess what I think about ham radio these days in terms of, what makes it different is it's like a license to learn. And because hams are inquiring types, and we're hands-on types. It's one of the few venues left, I think, that allows people to solve problems with their mind and fix things with their hands. Does that make sense?
Oh, it's a very good example. And, we are left to our devices to do things and experiment with things. And, we actually have a bigger leeway than a manufacturer because we don't have to get our project type accepted. We just have to be accountable for them if they are objectionable. So I think you're absolutely right on course with that.
Yeah, I had Dr. Ulrich Rohde, N1UL, in episode 208 of the QSO Today podcast, and he said that an amateur radio license is a license to learn, and that what we're given with a license is radio spectrum from DC to blue light in which to experiment in without having to do, as you say, get type acceptance.
Yes.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think that really sums it up. As I said, to be a manufacturer and try to put a piece of gear on the market, you got to jump through a lot of governmental hoops. And if you have the knowledge or care to learn the knowledge to do it yourself, you're free to go at it. You're still accountable for what you do, but you're allowed to do it without a lot of government regulation.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Oh, the demise of the sunspot cycle. We hear every day that the bands are dead, and so one day I told you I have a 7600 ICOM, and my friend Jeff WDPER has the same rig, and we would say, "Man, your audio sounds good," and I'd say, "Well, yours sounds good," and let's go on and check parameters on how we've got them set up and this and that, and Jeff says, let's go to 12 meters. There's nobody there, and we won't disturb anybody. We'll just pick the middle of the band, and we'll just go back and forth and change things and fuss with these radios. So we went there, and everybody knows the bands, they're dead. So we were discussing what have you got this set at, that set up, and Jeff came back and he said, "Hey, I think we got company. I heard somebody else in there," and I hadn't. So we took a pause, and we had a station come in from I think he was around Jacksonville, Florida, and he said, "Yeah, I've been listening to you guys. It's interesting." And the bands are dead. And so we started asking him about 12 meters and what to expect there, and he said, "Oh, he gets on it every day." And so I started exploring 17 meters and some of those that, we just kind of shy away from. And even at supposedly the bottom of the sunspot cycle, and of course there's questions about that, if we had a double bottom or, where is it really? There's still, if people get in and call CQ and make themselves known, there's still opportunities every day on just about every one of those HF bands to find it if you're persistent.
All the magazines are talking about, the sunspot cycle being at the bottom and how the bands are dead, except on contest weekends when the bands aren't dead.
Especially, in the VHF contests. They just come to life,
So it's interesting that perhaps we have this anticipation that because we're at the bottom of the sunspot cycle, the bands are dead, and so that we just don't get on, and we just don't call CQ. Everyone's listening, waiting for something to happen. I also hear this in the, as you say, up in VHF and UHF, that you don't hear anybody because everybody's listening for someone else to talk.
Yeah, that's true. And we've also considered that maybe there's an unknown property that has never been discussed or researched, that when we all get on in force, maybe we do actually do something to the ether that makes it more conducive to long distance communication. But that's just a far out thought.
John, what advice would you give to newer returning hams?
Oh, stay dedicated to the hobby. It's surpassed by none other as far as I'm concerned.
Well, that sounds like a nice way to end our QSO. John, thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. It's been my pleasure. 73.
I've enjoyed it too, and a shout out to my friend in 4KGL, Greg Lane. Thank you, Eric. It's been fun.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with John. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W8JER in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.